program tonight, so I'll go ahead and get that started. Again, this is bird-friendly coffee and chocolate. Just going to share a little bit of information about Denver Audubon. And let me go ahead and get that going. Thank you. There it is. So we are Denver Audubon. Our mission is inspiring actions for birds and other wildlife through conservation, education, and research. And this organization was established over 50 years ago. We are an independent chapter of National Audubon. There is also a regional chapter called Audubon Rockies. They cover Colorado, Wyoming, Nebraska, and I think it's the 3 states that they cover. So we are an independent chapter, which means we do raise most of our own funding through grants, programs, and supporters like some of you. So thank you to those of you who have supported Denver Audubon financially. We have many different programs that we do. We do live birding field trips. We have school programs. Maybe you visited our nature center. If you have ever participated in any of our programs, give us a thumbs up through the participant screen. Tonight we will be using the participant screen and the chat screen, so you might want to open those up. We can't do all of those programs without the support of our over 150 volunteers last year who helped us with running all of these different programs. Tonight, we are doing a Conservation in Colorado lecture series that's based on the 7 simple actions to help birds. This comes out of the report from 2019 that said that the bird populations are down across almost all species, and they've come up with 7 simple actions that anybody can do to help the birds. So tonight we're focusing on drinking shade-grown coffee and are talking about bird-friendly coffee and chocolate. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our presenter, Sarah Doxon from Bird Conservancy of the Rockies, who will be giving us more information about what that is and how we can find it for our own homes. So Sarah, if you want to go ahead, thanks so much for being here.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Susie. We are so excited that we get to partner with Denver Audubon for this webinar. Let me go ahead and get my screen pulled up here. See another beautiful warbler. Okay. So yes, tonight we are going to be talking about coffee, cacao, and conservation. And before we dive right in, like Susie mentioned, my name is Sarah Doxon. I'm an environmental educator with Bird Conservancy of the Rockies. And if you are an avid birder or a bird nerd, as we lovingly call ourselves, whenever someone asks you, what's your favorite bird? It's always a trick question because for me, it changes every day. So today, my favorite bird is the common loon, not a neotropical migrant like we'll be talking about some today, but they just remind me of of summers from childhood visiting my grandparents in northern Minnesota. So if you would like to type in the chat box what your favorite bird today is, I can get to know you a little better. So, and just thank you all so much for being here tonight. A little bit about Bird Conservancy, if you're not familiar with us. We are a conservation-based nonprofit. Our headquarters are in Brighton, Colorado at Bar Lake State Park. And we also have a satellite office up in Fort Collins. But we do work all throughout the Northern Great Plains and down into Mexico as well. So our mission is to help conserve birds and their habitats. And we do that by approaching conservation from kind of 3 different angles to kind of get this wholehearted approach. So we have our science team. They are the ones out doing that boots on the ground research, monitoring bird populations, seeing what's going on, and giving us an idea of where we are and what we need to do. We also have our stewardship team. They are out working with private landowners, so mainly farmers and ranchers. And what they do is they help these people to implement conservation practices on their land that not only is going to benefit the birds and other wildlife in the land itself, but also be beneficial for their ranching and farming businesses as well. And then last but not least, we have our education team, which I am a part of, and we just have the best jobs in the world. I think we get to interact with folks virtually now these days, but nevertheless, we're doing what we can to teach people from kindergarten. I was telling Susie I had a kindergarten program earlier today, all the way up to just however old you are and you want to learn about birds, we will teach you about birds. So today we are going to discover what it means for coffee and cacao to be labeled as bird friendly. We'll talk about how this distinction is helping to conserve birds and their habitats, and most importantly, what you can do to help. Because as Susie mentioned, I think it's so funny, we have a pretty much identical slide. This is part of these 7 simple actions that came out of the 3 Billion Birds Lost study. Bird Conservancy, our avian conservation scientist, Arvind Panjabi, was one of the authors on this study, so we're incredibly proud of him. And these are the actions that came out of it. So we've lost, collectively, we've lost 3 billion birds since 1970, which is a devastating number to think about. But part of that study was also that there is hope. There is just so much evidence that conservation works, whether we're talking about the recovery of raptors or game birds and waterfowl populations coming back. We know that conservation works, and that's part of what Audubon and Bird Conservancy, we're working from that side to conserve birds, but it takes the efforts of everyone. And so here's some really fun things that we can do every day to make sure we're helping out the birds. So first of all, I want to introduce you to a few birds that you might have seen around Colorado or wherever you lived before. So go ahead and type in the chat box if you have a guess of what this adorable little fellow might be. Let's see, oh, someone guessed a thrush. Yes, very good. And I know thrushes can be tricky. So this one is a, maybe advance the slide. There we go, is a Swainson's thrush. And if you have never explored eBird and looked at their range maps and their migratory maps, they are so cool. They even have ones that have animations. I highly suggest taking a gander at eBird and playing with those. So if we look at our distribution map here, we can see that Swainson's thrushes, they are spending their summers where the red is, way up north in Canada and Alaska, and they're migrating through the US. We'll see them here in Colorado, and then their destination for the winter, it looks like in the blue here, down in Central America, and even down pretty far into South America as well. So I want you to keep that in mind of where these birds are wintering. So we have Central and down into South America. All right, how about this little one? Who do we have here? Type it in the chat box if you have a guess. And even if you're not sure, that's okay. Thinking means you're learning. Guessing is always great. And sometimes I can see my chat box and sometimes I can't, so I apologize if I'm missing anything.
Well, we have multiple guesses for
Wilson's
warbler.
Wonderful, brava, everyone. This is a Wilson's warbler. And if you have ever visited our banding stations, either at Bar Lake or at the Audubon Center down at Chatfield State Park, you have definitely seen one of these handsome guys. This is a handsome guy, a male Wilson's warbler that we have here. So again, looking at their range map, they are summering, they're breeding up in Alaska and mostly Western Canada. They're migrating down through the US. And then again, this blue, they are wintering down in Mexico and in Central America. And then I have one more. I won't make your brains work too hard. I know it's the end of a long work day. Any guesses for this one? Okay, so
Have a couple of different guesses. We have a couple for a blue-gray gnatcatcher. Somebody said nuthatch.
those are both great guesses. The first one was correct. This is a blue-gray gnatcatcher, although I definitely could see why you would say nuthatch. They do look similar. So the range map for our blue-gray gnatcatcher, we don't see them as often in Colorado, but they still certainly are here. So there's Colorado on the map. They definitely, some of them will breed here. Some of them migrate through. And then it's interesting, the other maps didn't have a whole lot of purple, but this one does. And the purple is where these birds can be found year round. So in these regions where we were seeing the other birds spending their winters, the blue-gray gnatcatcher could be considered a resident bird or a migrant down in this more southern part. So I say that all because I want to compare it with the coffee belt. So this is where most coffee and most cacao, which is what gets turned into chocolate, is grown. So if we look, it overlaps with the winter range or even the resident range of a lot of birds. We call them neotropical migrants. And as I mentioned, they're home to many resident birds. And these areas have a really high level of biodiversity and a lot of birds that are endemic to those regions, meaning that they're not found anywhere else in the world. And so if those birds are to lose habitat, they really don't have anywhere else to go, which is not good news for the bird, of course. So we asked this in the very beginning, and it looked like there were quite a few people who had visited a coffee or cacao farm. So I'm wondering, Susie, if we could go into breakout rooms. And once you get into your breakout room, if you just kind of want to share where you were, what was it, coffee or cacao, kind of what you noticed, what they taught you, things like that.
So I am creating the rooms now, and I'm trying to just split people up a little bit so that we are sure to have at least one person who has visited a plantation in each room. And it looks like I have been able to do that. And then I'm also going to make sure that we have a Denver Audubon representative in each room so that we can help lead the conversation. So I'm going to go ahead and put you into breakout rooms now. It will ask if you want to join the breakout room. You just say yes, and then you'll be in another smaller Zoom group. I'm going to give you 4 minutes to just share your experiences of those plantations and what you saw while you were there. So I'm going to open those rooms now. So hello, everybody. Again, my name is Susie, and I will start by saying that, yes, I did visit a coffee plantation in Costa Rica. It was for an ecology field trip when I was getting my degree about 5 years ago. I went back to school to get a conservation degree and conservation ecology, and I visited a coffee plantation that was called a shade-grown coffee plantation, and it was actually a small farm. It wasn't even a plantation, it was a small farm with a local farmer who had his coffee plants there. So who else here has visited a plantation? Uh-oh, I think.
Most recent one for me was Colombia, and it was shade grown, and it was very small. It was like little sections of small shade areas, but I've visited several in many South American countries, both coffee and cacao.
So what does, I know what a coffee plant looks like, and I think a lot of us have probably seen pictures of it at some point, but I have no idea what a cacao plant is.
It's very interesting. It's a huge pod, and you would have no idea that that was chocolate, but it's a very large pod, and the way they process it is nothing I could.
Thank you all so much for being good sports and joining in the conversation. Okay. So, give me 1 second. There we go. Okay, so in case you have never been to a coffee plantation before, here's a few images of what a typical one looks like. Depending on where you're visiting, it might be called a farm or a plantation, a finca or a hacienda. There's probably a lot more, many more names for it, but those are the ones that I'm familiar with. So you can see so the top left and the bottom right pictures are just kind of, the overview look. And you can see that there is not a lot of plant life other than these little coffee plants. The top right are the little coffee bushes, like Susie mentioned. They do grow on these little bushes. And then the bottom left is the actual fruit of the coffee plant. So inside, and they're called coffee cherries, and inside of that is the bean. And so what happens is after they pick all of the coffee berries or coffee cherries off, they are usually dried out by the sun. They're laid out on these huge cement pads, and they're raked and they're turned every day, and they're dried out by the sun. And then after they're dried out, they're hulled, and the bean inside is what then gets cleaned and sorted and grated and all of that, roasted, and then we get to consume it as coffee. Which I just think is so cool. Cacao is a very similar process as well, but instead we get chocolate. And this is what cacao looks like. So they do grow on trees that are taller than the coffee bushes, and they grow in these pods that just grow right off the trunk of the tree. It is really, really fascinating. And then once they are ripe, they are split open, and inside are these big beans, and they're really slimy, and they smell really, really sweet. They do not taste good, can confirm that. They don't taste good until they're actually made into ground cacao and into chocolate. But again, those beans are, they're actually allowed to ferment, so that slimy kind of outer coating is fermented in these barrels, and then dried, and then hulled, and then ground into cacao, into chocolate. So going back to these pictures here, and knowing that probably most of our coffee and cacao does not come from shade grown, what do you think about that? How might that affect birds? Or maybe it doesn't matter. What do you think? Go ahead and type in the chat box. Are these kinds of habitats helpful or harmful to our birds, like the Wilson's warbler and the blue-gray gnatcatcher we saw at the beginning?
So I do see some people busily typing away.
Yeah.
One person says less protection from predators in open areas.
Mm-hmm.
If it causes deforestation, that's not good. But every place I've been have been bird friendly, or every place they've seen has been bird friendly. Another person says that shade grown coffee offers much more habitat for migratory birds.
Mm-hmm.
Someone else says that there's probably with in the sunny ones, not enough variety of plant life.
Excellent.
Possibly in the shade grown too. I don't know. That would be a good question.
Yeah, excellent. You guys are right on the money. So I'm from Iowa, so I'm obligated to use a cornfield as an example. But we know that monocultures, or an ecosystem that's dominated by one species, do not support a high level of biodiversity. So the more variation that there is in plant life in a certain area, the type, the height, the growing period, whether they produce fruits, things like that, the more diverse species that that ecosystem can support. So the vast majority of coffee farms are these monocultures, which means that they can't support a wide variety of birds, mammals, insects, etc. And another thing, in these regions in Central and South America, a lot of their land that has historically been made up of forest is being converted to pasture land as well. So again, that is not conducive for a high level of biodiversity. And we know that the neotropical migrants and the resident birds, they really thrive and really need these forest habitats in order to do well. So what is the answer, right? How can we restore habitat for these wintering and resident birds while also supporting coffee farmers and ranchers, people who are trying to make a living in these areas? Well, one way, as you might have guessed and why you're here, is bird-friendly coffee and cacao. So the Smithsonian has been researching how to achieve this balance for over 2 decades. They've been at it for a while. They first introduced the idea back in 1996. So they have the highest standards for how to produce a product that is bird friendly. There's a lot that goes into it. There's many other factors. But the 3 primary things are that all of the coffee is 100% organic. And that's important because there are certain labeling laws for that, right? For something to be called organic, it has to meet a certain standard. Whereas things can be labeled natural, but that doesn't really have any legal pull. It could be labeled natural, but what does that really mean? Another thing is that all of the coffee is 100% pure. So other labels might be able to claim shade grown or claim other, bird friendly or things like that. But, and we'll get into this a bit later, there could be a certain amount of that product, I think up to 30% of that product could be not shade grown or could be coming from a less sustainable source. And then, of course, shade grown. So we're going to take a little bit closer look at this because not all shade grown is created equal, which someone alluded to in their answer. So again, this bird friendly, just like the label organic carries weight, this bird friendly is trademarked by the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center. And like I said, it's the gold standard. Right now, I believe it's only on coffee, but they are working on getting it available for cacao and chocolate as well. And like I said, this is important because it's been backed by decades of research, and they've done a lot of hard work to figure out what is that balance of conservation action that we can take that's not going to be detrimental to the farmers and the people trying to make their livelihoods, because that is a hugely important part of conservation that often gets overlooked. That's why we have a stewardship team at Bird Conservancy, because we can't just go anywhere and say, hey, you have to grow these other plants, you have to do shade grown coffee, because it just might not be feasible for the people who are trying to make a living. And again, we'll get into that a little bit more. Okay, so shade grown, what's the big deal? Well, there are kind of these 3 things that help make shade grown really, really great. So the first thing is, like I mentioned, is supporting farmers. So the areas where coffee comes from, and what we're really talking about today is kind of Central and Northern South America, but also, places in Africa, India, Malaysia, places like that, are some of the poorest in the world. And just like farming here in the US, it is not an easy job and there are no guarantees, right? There's so many factors that can affect your bottom line at the end of the day. So by helping farmers to transition to shade-grown coffee, they do have a chance to actually get a higher price for their coffee because it can be considered gourmet. They can also gain profit from the fruit trees and the lumber trees that they add to provide that shade on their farms. And then, of course, looking at the big picture, we think, and the evidence points to, by growing shade-grown coffee, they are much more buffeted from the effects of climate change, from the greater rainfall, the more intense temperatures, things like that. Like I mentioned, though, this is far from perfect. There are many farmers in these areas that just might not be aware that this certification even exists, or it's simply too costly to make the change to become certified. So the Smithsonian is working really hard to make this a more accessible and equitable endeavor. So that's a huge piece to the shade grown. Taste. I will admit, I am actually not an avid coffee drinker. I don't do caffeine well, but my husband is, and many of my coworkers are, and they attest that they really, really like the taste of shade-grown coffee. And so what happens is shade-grown coffee takes longer to mature on the plant, and so that gives it more time to develop these more complex and robust flavors. And then, of course, there are ecological benefits, which we'll dive into next. And please, I forgot to say, as we're going, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to type them into the chat box, and we'll have some time for Q&A at the end as well. Okay. So this is a graphic from the Smithsonian, kind of so that we can see the difference between the sun-grown and what shade-grown coffee really looks like. Historically, actually, coffee was shade-grown. So I believe, in Central America, it started in the 1800s where they started to grow coffee. They did clear the underbrush out of the forest and grew coffee plants. But then, we figured out that, hey, if we just clear cut, we can have a lot more coffee plants and increase our profitability. There were also some things having to do with pest insects and other, plant diseases, things like that, where by having more sun and that more kind of intense environment helped the coffee plants to grow better and to resist those diseases. So now what is the, the most widespread method is this kind of clear cutting the forest and growing sun coffee. But that's not really the best ecologically, right? So on this slide here, we can see as far as bird species and bird diversity goes, the sun-grown coffee, there were 61 bird species that they can find. In the partial shade, 79. And then in what the Smithsonian deems to be bird-friendly shade-grown, they found 243 species. That is absolutely incredible. Like that's almost 200 more species difference, which is just bananas, right? So many more. And what I kind of alluded to earlier is that you can see in this zone where again, the Smithsonian deems bird-friendly, there is so much diversity in this plant life. There's all different levels, all different species. But there are some companies that, where it says partial shade, they can still claim shade grown, which is still better than full sun, but maybe not quite as good, on the other end of the spectrum. So, right, as I said, the more cover, the more diversity of plant structure, the better able an area is to host a high biodiversity. So these are, kind of a deeper dive into the ecological benefits of growing coffee and cacao in the shade. So the species health and diversity, so we covered that, but the health. So we know that a lot of these birds are migrating. And if they are migrating and say, you know, like it is now, there's much less forests than probably what they need and what there had been. So when they are getting ready to migrate back to the US and Canada, they are not as able to find the fuel, the food that they need to get going. So by growing shade grown and having a bigger diversity of trees, there's going to be more insects, more fruits, all of these other food sources, so that these birds are going to have a much higher fitness level and have a much greater chance of being successful in their migration. Also from a soil conservation perspective, so the topography, a lot of these regions is very hilly, even mountainous. We saw on one of those slides, I mean, they were just straight down, right in the valley, and there were coffee plants planted right on the hillsides. So you can imagine these areas are also prone to a lot of rainfall, right? So bare hillsides, lots of rainfall equals massive soil erosion. So by having other plants in there, especially big trees that have really solid root structures, we're going to be able to conserve a lot of that soil. And the soil is going to be healthier as well, not only because it doesn't wash away, but because there's going to be more nutrients in it. The leaves that are falling from the trees are going to get recycled back into the soil, and the soil is just going to be healthier overall. Also, as far as pest control and pollination. So this is really a direct result of increased biodiversity. If there are more animals like birds and bats and lizards, things like that, that love to eat insects such as the coffee berry borer, which is a really terrible pest for coffee plants, as you can imagine. Well, if we have more of its predators around, then that's a natural control mechanism rather than having to go in and spray pesticides and herbicides and all of that nasty stuff, which is not only, you know, of course, we know it can bioaccumulate as we consume things that have been treated with those, but also then in conjunction with the soil erosion and the water runoff that can pollute the waterways of these local areas too. And then for pollination, of course, coffee is a plant. It needs pollinators to be able to reproduce. So again, the more diversity we have, the more pollinators, the more pollination is going to happen. And then lastly, just thinking about all big picture of you know, pulling back and looking at how this affects climate change overall. So we have more shade that keeps the soil moisture from evaporating. So they don't have to do as much, you know, unnecessary watering. It reduces the need for harmful chemicals, and it just helps to restore a somewhat natural balance among the flora and fauna. So, and also all of those trees, there's more biomass. It acts as a carbon sink, so keeps carbon in the soil and in the plant material rather than in our atmosphere. So that will have a positive impact on climate change as well. And again, all of this is coming from decades of research from not only the Smithsonian, but lots and lots of other institutions as well that they've been conducting for quite a while.
Sarah?
Yeah.
We have a question in the chat, and the question is, somebody's already put it down, is shade grown synonymous with sustainable?
Ooh, very good question. We're actually going to get to that on my next slide. I was like, I'm pretty sure I'm going to talk about that. Good question. Let's get to that. So what can you do? How can you know if something is truly shade grown? Is it sustainable? Is there a difference? What do all these terms mean? It can be really confusing. So what I suggest is that you treat yourself or your friends or your family, your neighbors, anyone, to some bird-friendly products. So, like I said, this bird-friendly label, that is a trademark of Smithsonian, that guarantees that 100% of the product is shade grown, is organic, it's pure, there's nothing else in there. The farmers have been treated fairly, they've gotten a fair market price, all of those kinds of things. So there are a couple of brands that I recommend. Birds and Beans is a wonderful roaster, and then also Wood Warbler Coffee. So Birds and Beans, you can buy them online, and it's very exciting. They just started distributing in a lot of natural grocers along the Front Range. We love them because they support bird-friendly coffee and organizations. So actually buying from them, they do donate a portion of their proceeds back to Bird Conservancy, which we are so appreciative of. Wood Warbler coffee is also just really, really cool. I highly suggest you check out their website because they partner with a ton of other conservation organizations as well. We are actually their featured partner for November, which was hugely serendipitous because I had no idea when I told Susie, yeah, I can do this one in November. And then I found out that we're their partner just yesterday. So you can go to their website and you could buy, you know, like, I think Audubon on the Rockies might even be on there. So you can buy their blend, or you can buy the Bird Conservancy blend, or all of these different organizations. And 10% of that goes back to those conservation, or yeah, to those organizations. So we can keep doing this important conservation work. So that's really, really neat. So moving on, you probably are more familiar with our little green tree frog emblem here, the Rainforest Alliance certified. So this is not quite as strict, I guess. Doesn't have quite as strict regulations as the bird friendly, but it still is a very, very good choice. It's still, you know, it's still organic and shade grown and fair trade, you know, single origin, all of these things. The thing with Rainforest Alliance is that it's not guaranteed that the product is 100% of all of those things. And that has a lot to do with offsetting of cost. And like I mentioned earlier, especially for, you know, at the source, for the farmers, converting their plantations or their farms to 100% shade grown to these really, really kind of strict regulations just might not be possible. But that doesn't mean they can't do anything. They can have it be partially shade grown or be in that process and still be Rainforest Alliance certified. So that's the really long-winded answer to that question of does shade grown equal sustainable? There are kind of all of these buzzwords that we look for. So I would say in short, yes, it does. It absolutely contributes to sustainability. But there's a lot of other factors too, right? So, you know, you can look at a lot of companies, even if they can't source their products from, you know, a bird-friendly certified plantation, they might offset their carbon through wind energy or something like that, right? So there's all of these different things that contribute to sustainability. So there are some buzzwords to look for, right? Sustainable, organic, shade grown, single origin, fair trade. A lot of those are protected by labeling laws so that you know it is having a positive impact. I hope that answers your question. Do you have any other questions before I move on? See, does fair trade have anything to do with shade grown? No, so fair trade does not have anything necessarily to do with shade grown. Fair trade is just making sure that the farmers are not taken advantage of. Again, they're from, you know, these really undersourced communities a lot of times, and we want to make sure that they're not getting taken advantage of, that they get a fair price for the product that they're providing. So fair trade more has to do with compensation of the farmer, where shade grown is the growing conditions. Yes, Allegro Coffee, they have their early bird is a bird-friendly blend. Thank you for mentioning that.
I think you got most of the questions. There was a comment about shade-grown coffee tends to be more expensive. What measures can be taken to make it more appealing to ordinary consumers?
Absolutely, that is a wonderful question. So yes, it is more expensive. And, you know, I would compare that to if you want to buy, you know, an organic apple versus a conventionally grown apple, that organic apple is going to be more expensive. So I was looking at the Birds and Beans. I think it ran about $13 for a 12 or 16 ounce package, which, to be fair, is more than you would pay for a can of Folgers, right? And what I try to do, because we're not all made out of money, and you're here at this conservation conversation, and we all have big hearts and we want to do everything we can. So what I try to do is kind of make a commitment to what I'm able to do, right? So I may not be able to buy all organic food, but I know that my husband drinks a lot of coffee, so I want to make sure that coffee consumption is sustainable. So that's kind of how I make it more appealing to myself. And then maybe some months, we'll switch or we'll take a break or something like that, because it definitely can take a hit on our bank accounts as well. But I think also thinking about, again, that big picture of how much this is contributing to the sustainability of our planet, and of these, honestly, third world countries where this product is coming from, and making sure that they are getting a fair trade as well. And I think this next one, I'm almost to the end of my slides here, because you can't forget about chocolate, which is my favorite and where I get excited about this. So this company is not a sponsor. They're not giving any proceeds back to us or anything. I simply just found them when I was searching bird-friendly chocolate. So bird-friendly cacao and chocolate is pretty far behind bird-friendly coffee. I mentioned you can find the Smithsonian label on coffee, but not necessarily on chocolate yet, I don't think. So this is where looking for those other labels and buzzwords like Rainforest Alliance certified, organic, fair trade, single origin, really pay attention to those on chocolate products. But this company that I found is so cool, because they sell like packages basically, and they focus totally on, they've done all this research on what they consider to be bird-friendly chocolate. And what they're doing now is they are hosting tasting parties. So you can order like this platter of chocolate basically, and just like, a wine sommelier or something like that, you can host a chocolate tasting party with all your friends, and they are offering it via Zoom, of course, these days. But I just thought that was so neat that you could taste chocolate just like you could taste wine or cheese or something like that. So the holidays are coming up. I'm definitely putting that on my list to either give or receive. I haven't decided yet, but I just thought that sounded so fun. Okay, so that is kind of all of the information that I have for you folks now. I do just want to say, please keep in touch with us. We are so sad, missing all of our in-person programs so much, but we are trying to do a lot of these webinars. So keep an eye on our Facebook page, on our website calendar. If you have any questions or anything, you can always email us. And we just really, really thank you for being here tonight. So yeah, what other questions do we have?
Another very good question is, why is single source important?
Great question. So single source is important because that's meaning it's coming from either one region or even one farm, right? So the more that we can focus on keeping that product pure, the more we can know, see, how do I want to say it? Yeah, the more that we can focus on like keeping that product the way it is, or the way it was meant to be, the higher quality it's going to be. So just like we a food farm table, the catchphrase or chocolate bean bar, and then shipping and things like that, contributing to adding carbon to the atmosphere and things like that.
And then what about direct trade as opposed to fair trade? Direct trade. Do you know anything about that labeling?
I don't. That's a really good question though. I'll have to look that up.
Anybody here know anything?
Yeah, if anyone does, chime in.
And then while we research the direct trade, there's another question about, do you see any trend for the big coffee chains like Starbucks, heading toward any shade-grown coffee, or is it still too expensive for them to offer?
Yeah, so I was doing some research on Starbucks, and they don't use the trademark bird-friendly coffee, but they do a lot of work to make sure that their coffee is grown sustainably as possible. Again, to keep the price for their consumer down, and that their farmers and producers are compensated fairly. So I think it's definitely on the right track, right? And it's just such a balance of keeping the prices down for the consumer, making sure that the producers get paid fairly, making sure that we're taking care of the planet. It's a huge balancing act.
Great, thank you. We did, Kate, who's also Denver Audubon representative, did find a link to the difference between fair trade versus direct trade coffee. So you can follow that link to learn more about that. And then we do still have some time left. And what I would like to do for the next 5 or 10 minutes is I would like for us to think about what we are going to plan on doing ourselves in our own homes. Is this something that you think you want to look for? Are you going to start purchasing coffees? Are there some other options that you can think of in terms of making a difference with our migrating birds and the forests that are the tropical rainforests? So I think I'm going to break us out into breakout rooms again, and go ahead, and I'm just looking for my questions here. So yeah, discuss any personal actions that you want to take, and maybe share with each other. Do you know of anywhere that does sell bird-friendly coffee? Would you feel comfortable? Another question is, how can we encourage places like Starbucks or our local grocery stores to start carrying these different brands? And I'm going to go ahead and put us into 2 rooms because we have had a few people leave us already. And make sure I've got, all right, so I'm going to go ahead and just put us into some little bit smaller groups than this and do a little bit of sharing about actions we can take. Welcome back, everybody. So yeah, we had a good conversation in our room about actions that we're going to take, asking for the coffee and bird-friendly coffee when we go places to purchase it, and just that power of asking for it over and over again until finally they're like, okay, maybe we should look into this and get some of it. We talked about coffee, bird-friendly coffee as gifts, both asking for it for ourselves as well as giving it to the coffee drinkers in our family. We also talked about the comparison in pricing of bird-friendly coffee and the sticker shock of, oh, that bag of coffee is so much, but then comparing it to going to a coffee shop and getting the coffee made for us. The pricing of the bird-friendly coffee is actually less than purchasing cups of coffee at some of the more expensive coffee shops. What else did I miss, Mary? Was there something else of note?
No, I think that was pretty much it. Scott had, what was that book called? The Monk of Mocha. That was a cool book recommendation.
Oh, cool.
Kind of just a more general history of coffee stuff.
Oh. Yeah, Scott, if you could share that in the chat, just the title and the author so that we can all see that, that would be fabulous. Thank you. And then Sarah, what did your room discuss?
Yeah, I thought Julia had a really great comparison. And just like you were talking about, Susie, just like how organic food used to not really be a thing, right? The ordinary folk really didn't have access to it. It was only at Whole Foods or specialty stores. And then it became more, people started to demand it more. And now you can find organic versions of foods pretty much anywhere. And so exactly, the more that we keep inquiring about it, and demanding it, even if you want to go so strong in that way, then the more likely it's going to show up and be more easily accessible. And I think the great thing about that is there are so many folks who might be avid coffee drinkers, but really don't know a whole lot about conservation. And they're just browsing the aisles at Trader Joe's or King Super, and they see this new label and, maybe go home and do some research. So that's another way that we can just spread the message of conservation and get people to consume more responsibly too. So getting these products in more, widely known stores, I think, is a really powerful way to spread the conservation message too.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Sarah, do you have any closing remarks?
I want to extend my gratitude to everyone for spending a Tuesday evening with us and learning about bird-friendly coffee and chocolate. And go ahead and follow us on Facebook, see what else we're up to. Yeah, thank you all so much.
And any closing questions before we go that you thought of? Well, great. We do have some more in this series that are coming up. Again, you can support Denver Audubon and also Bird Conservancy of the Rockies by joining our communications lists. So you can go to our websites to do that. You can become a local supporter to fund this program and other education programs that share the word about birds and how we can take care of them. If you donate in Denver Audubon, just put Conservation in Colorado in the comments field so that we know that this is where you heard and we're inspired to take that little action. We do have a couple more events for Denver Audubon, our fall celebration, which reviews last fiscal year briefly. And then we have a guest speaker, conservation biologist Stan Temple, who is going to be talking about Aldo Leopold's work and how that inspires conservation then and today. And we have a Partners in Flight database program in partnership with Denver field ornithologists talking about what is the Partners in Flight database and how it's informing conservation. And then as part of the 7 simple actions to help birds, the next one coming up is going to be the Birding for Yourself in Science in January. In February, we're going to be talking about happy cats and healthy birds. In March, talking about how we can make buildings bird-friendly in the metro area. And in April, we're going to be talking about pesticides, how they affect birds directly and indirectly. So thank you very much for being here tonight. I really appreciate your support. Your attendance especially really supports us through other fundraising efforts as well. And I will send an email out to all of you with some of the names of some of the brands that we talked about and links, helpful links, and that kind of thing. And Sarah, before we go there, we did have a question, and that was, what were the names of the chocolates, the bird-friendly chocolates? I caught Cocoa Case, but I didn't catch some of those others. Can you?
Oh, that's a good question. Let me pull that back up for a second.
Hey, Susie, while she's doing that, are you going to send a reminder about those January and February ones since they're a little further out?
Yes, I can certainly do that. I'll send something out. Maybe I'll send something out 2 or 3 weeks before those programs to people who have participated in the Conservation in Colorado. Good question, good suggestion, Lori. Thanks.
Thanks.
Excuse me, I just got into the class, so is it going to be where you can see it afterwards at all or not?
Yes, I am going to send everybody who registered a link to the recording.
Oh, thanks so much.
You're welcome. Sorry.
I guess I need to write it on my calendar because I was just out running errands and forgot.
No worries. Glad you could make us for the last few minutes.
Thanks. Sarah,
did you find the names of those chocolates?
Yeah, so the organization that I mentioned was Cocoa Case, so COCOACASE.com. And then it looks like some of the chocolates they have on their site that they recommend are, the only one I recognize that I've seen in stores is Cho, I think how you pronounce it, TCHO. Also Crow and Moss, and Ninth and Larkin. Larkin. But I would bet if you if you were to go to a natural grocer's, excuse me, or Whole Foods or something like that and look for ones that say bean to bar, fair trade, those kinds of things, would be a good bet.
Great, thank you for that. Well, unless anybody else has another question or any other comments, I think we are good to go. Thanks so much for